Hello, my name is Bob Stein. I'm a professor of political science at Rice University, and I'm here today to present to you the findings of a white paper that my colleagues and I have written on in-person voting, best practices and new areas for research. This research was supported by the MIT Election Data Science Lab as part of their larger project, Mapping the Election Administration and Election Science Initiative. My colleagues who join me in this project include Lisa Bryant, an associate professor of political science and chair of the Department of Political Science at California State Fresno; David Kimball, professor of political science and chair of the Department of Political Science at the University of Missouri St. Louis; Gretchen Mack, an associate professor of industrial and systems engineering at the University of Rhode Island; Anita Mannion, an assistant professor of political science at the University of Missouri St. Louis; and Mindy Romero, an assistant research professor of public policy at the University of Southern California and director of the University of Southern California Center for Inclusive Democracy. After a steady decline in-person voting between the 2000 and the 2020 election, we saw a significant rebound in 2022 of in-person voting, either on or before election day. We suspect that in-person early voting and election day voting will remain the modal means of casting a ballot going forward into the 2024 election. For us, the question is, what are the best practices that assure that voters turn out, that voters are confident their ballot will be counted as they intended, and that voters will continue to vote in the future if they want to at in-person polling locations on or before election day. We've identified several best practices, and these are practices that are continuing with in-person voting that assure us that voter turnout remains high, that voter satisfaction remains high, that voter confidence remains high, and that voters who want to vote in person will do so in future elections. These best practices include assuring all voters live within 1 mile of their respective polling location. Research has repeatedly shown that this 1 mile demarcation is critical to getting voters to show up in person early or on election day. Number 2, keep waiting times under 30 minutes. Research, again, has extensively shown that at or beyond 30 minutes, voters not only leave the voter line, but they don't approach the voter line. And most importantly, a bad experience, a long waiting time of 30 or longer minutes, assures that voters will not return to that polling location or possibly any polling location in future elections. Third, the use of electronic vote books, or what we call e-books, to check in voters. In most states, there's a requirement to have a photographic ID. That usually is a driver's license. The bar or magnetic strip on the back can be used to be swiped electronically to identify the voter's identification and quickly process them through the line. E-polling booths reduce waiting time, increase the speed with which voters are processed and can vote, and are one of the many contributing factors to a good voting experience at in-person polling locations. Fourth, configure and lay out polling locations in an efficient way to increase usability. The entrance and exit to a polling place should be clearly marked, should be separate to avoid congestion. The route from checking in to voting booth or kiosk should not conflict and lead to congestion. All of these are practices that have been widely used and widely implemented to assure that voters don't have to wait a long time to check in and to vote and to be confused about where to get to and from the polling location. Finally, we recommend that ballot features be adopted to reduce unrecorded vote and ballot errors. Ballots need to be clear, the font large, the location of candidate and offices in such a way that voters can move through the ballot quickly and have confidence that their vote intentions were properly recorded. These are all the practices that we think currently are used for in-person voting and an increase, as we said, voter participation, ballot completion, voter satisfaction, and confidence that their vote will be counted as they intended. Where do we have problems? Where do we need to do new research? One, there's a lack of information on how poll workers exercise discretion in requiring in the presentation of IDs. Research has shown that even though state laws are clear and possibly unambiguous, and that poll workers are trained, there's still a lot of discretion at the level of the poll worker, which has not been studied. We need to understand where this discretion leads to confusion about what is needed in the way of IDs, and when voters are excluded from voting possibly incorrectly. Second, election day vote centers pose a unique problem for the optimal siting and operation. Election day vote centers are like early voting. Voters on election day can vote at any location in their voting jurisdiction. Problem, many jurisdictions oversubscribe to election day vote centers without adequately staffing and equipping these locations, leading to congestion problems at some locations that are more popular, and leaving voters with many fewer choices on election day to go to a shorter line or to a location that may be less problematic. What we need here is to not only collect data on election day vote centers, but to adequately identify what can each jurisdiction support in the way of the number and location of election day vote centers. Third, we need more rigorous study by researchers with expertise in human factors engineering, computer science, and related fields. Human interactions with ballot marking devices, understanding how people enter and exit a polling location, how we understand whether or not the actual configuration of the space within the polling place increases or decreases the waiting time of other voters. This means bringing others into our research collaboration, exactly what we did with Gretchen Mack, an engineer who studies many of these kinds of questions. More research is needed to determine the most cost-effective ways for local election officials to collect data in the field. We need to know how long lines are. We need to know how long people wait to vote. We need to have information that details how many machines are at each polling location, how many poll workers are at each polling location. These are the kinds of data that have to be collected either in real time, shortly before or shortly after an election is conducted, and oftentimes these are not the kinds of tasks that election officials have time to complete. They're too busy actually running the election. As we'll talk about in a moment, there are ways we can address that problem. Finally, we need to get statewide or at best national best practices for polling place designs and layouts. And this addresses the previous question. Collecting the data about where and how we configure polling locations will tell us what the best practices are for polling locations, their designs and layouts, such that we can establish national, if not statewide, if not national standards. How can we best do some of this new research? Well, there are two ways that we think it can be done. One is to collaborate with local universities and colleges in the jurisdictions where elections are being conducted, and collaborate on the collection and research that we've outlined above. There's probably a college, university, community college in every voting jurisdiction that local officials can approach and talk to about collaborating with simple tasks of measuring waiting times, number of voting machines, poll workers, and this kind of data can be collected independent of the time demands that are on local election officials. We think these collaborations can be a permanent component of election officials' preparations for elections and postmortems. In my own jurisdiction of Harris County, we have worked at the university with local election officials to help them estimate voter turnout and an identification of the number and location of polling locations needed on election day and early voting. There are several examples of these collaborations that have been very successful. In 2016, Metzel initiated a collaboration among 28 election jurisdictions and local colleges and universities to simply study waiting times. Students were sent out to observe at as many polling locations as we could staff the time, number of people who were waiting to vote, people who left, who came back into line, and this data was shared with local election officials so they could better anticipate problems, resolve them for future elections. In 2021, Metzel funded a collaboration among 19 election jurisdictions and local colleges and universities to study the recruitment and retention of poll workers for the 2022 midterm election. The survey was conducted in real time before and after the election so that election officials could understand what it is they needed to do to both recruit and retain poll workers, particularly after the difficulties of the 2020 election. I hope some of these ideas resonate with people, and here is some of the information to contact any of us if you're interested in participating or working with us on these future research projects. Thank you for your time.